So welcome. This is Lydia Crafts, a candidate for House District 90 in November 3rd's election. Thanks so much for joining us again for my Community Coming Together series. I'm honored to have Bill Mook of Mook Sea Farm here today. We're going to talk a little bit about local aquaculture, what that looks like in our district and our county, and what it looks like at the legislative level, policy, how local small businesses interact with sort of our natural environment, one of our greatest assets in this district. So before we get going, just a quick update for folks. November 3rd is our general election. Absentee ballots can now be requested online or through your town office. I believe those ballots are going to be sent out starting October 3rd, so it's just around the corner. Please visit my website, lydiacrafts.com, for more information about my campaign. And be sure to follow us on Facebook. We have a bunch of weekly Facebook Live events coming up. And while the pandemic is still in full swing, we're looking for opportunities to engage voters. As I've said to many of you, I'm making a lot of phone calls these days. School has reopened. I've decided for public health reasons not to knock on doors, but I am still looking for every way to reach all of you and all of the voters in District 90. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And with that, Bill, I think we'll get going. So Bill, thank you so much for joining us here. Maybe just start with a little introduction about yourself and how you came in, the history of Mook Sea Farm.
Sure. So I've been doing this for a long time. I came to Maine in 1978, literally a day or two after I was married. And I went to attend the Graduate School of Oceanography at the Darling Center. Mm-hmm. And after doing several years of graduate work, I took a job just making money while I was actually working on a thesis at a commercial shellfish hatchery. And truth be told, I was interested in aquaculture, and it was one of the reasons why I came to Maine, but I'd gotten sort of sidetracked. In any event, I was working, just doing labor at this hatchery to make some money as a poor graduate student. And this is actually a true story. It was clear to me that it was called Bristol Shellfish. It was a shellfish hatchery. They were producing seed that they would sell to other shellfish farmers up and down the East Coast, which we've done since we started Mook Sea Farm. But it was obvious to me that the business was not doing very well. And one day the owner walked in, had a very heated conversation with the people who were managing and running the facility. And after probably about 5 or 10 minutes, he walked out, and on his way past me, and I was washing tanks, literally, he gave me his business card and told me, "Here, you're in charge now." So that's how I got in business, and we into the aquaculture, business itself. But then after working there for a few years and running the place, it was an old shrimp processing plant over in Moxie Cove. It was a huge facility, way bigger than was really required for the size of the seed market, and there were no nearby nursery sites that were very suitable. So eventually, we did bring it back to almost break even, but I started Mook Sea Farm in 1985. I think I started there in about 1982. And as severance pay, I was able to take a bunch of the equipment from the facility that was over Moxie Cove, and some of those tanks are still in use today in our hatchery.
Incredible.
So in 1985, we built a hatchery first on leased property. It was this little postage stamp. It was about a half an acre that we leased from a person down in Walpole, actually almost right next to where we are now. And after a few years working there, this piece of land that we now own came up for sale. We purchased that, built a new hatchery, and then over the years since that, I think we built the new building in 1989, and we've been on that site ever since. We originally started out growing seed. We were primarily a seed supplier, although we did get our first lease in the Damascus River in 1985. Or I'm sorry, 87, and it was very controversial. I liken the experience that I went through to being indicted for murder. The lease hearing was extremely contentious. We were going to do all kinds of horrible things to the river. There was a retired Marine Corps colonel who wrote to the Army Corps of Engineer saying that they needed to not let this go through, because if there was a national emergency, they needed to be able to bring naval ships up at the estuary to evacuate civilians. So it was crazy.
Yeah.
But once we got through that, things settled down.
And what did the aquaculture industry look like in this area back in the mid to late 80s?
I'm trying to think, there were maybe one or two. The Dodge Cove Marine Farms was in business. I think we were about the second one in the upper Damascus River. There was also a mussel farm in Clark's Cove, abandoned farm that was started by Ed Myers. And there had been other companies that had operated for a while before that, but it was very fledgling. It was really early stages. The technology wasn't that great in those days. and the markets weren't as big or as accessible as they grew to be. So we really focused a lot on technology. I mean, our whole mission is to use technology to produce a wholesome, natural product. And that's starting right in the hatchery all the way through the grow out phase and on our leases in the river. And we've grown I started with one employee in 1985, and we now have 30 or so that are full-time year-round employees.
Yeah, I was looking at your website earlier this week, Bill, and I noticed that a lot of your employees have worked in aquaculture from other states, other areas, and ended up here. Is that tell us a little bit about that, the line of work, and is that pretty common to find employees? When I think about the local economy, prior to the pandemic, I was hearing from a lot of small businesses saying, hey, it's really hard to find workers, with a low unemployment rate at that point. How has it been recruiting employees, retaining employees over the last 30 years?
It's a really great question. I think that as our reputation grew, and one of the things that as soon as we began to really grow and sort of figured out the technology and we're predictably profitable, one of the priorities we've always had is to try to compensate employees well. And we believe in paying a living wage. And that, I think, has helped us to be able to attract employees, to be honest with you. I mean, we also provide a group health plan, and there's a disability insurance policy that all of our employees get. So we really view our employees as the most valuable asset we have. If there's as valuable as the leases and everything else, because none of it works without good people. And that has helped. And I think something that people should know about the oyster industry in the Damascus River that is pretty impressive is that Smokey McKean and a bunch of us were sitting around at a table. We've all gotten together and we've created this Damascus River Oyster Celebration, and we're forming sort of a group of Damascus River growers to promote the Damascus River. I kind of shudder to use the analogy, but it's sort of like the Napa Valley of oysters, right?
Yeah.
And that it got sidetracked by the pandemic, but we're still working on all of that. But what we figured out was, sitting around this table, we sort of added up all the employees of all the different farms, and that stretch of the estuary from just north of the Route 1 bridge down to Glidden Point, which is just south of us, Fitch Point, just direct employees by the farms, it was pushing 100 people.
Wow.
And it's grown from virtually just these, little, me and one other employee and maybe a couple over here, to now, a lot of people whose livelihoods depend on it. And it's beginning, well, it actually is, I think, an important part of the local economy. When there are businesses that have sprouted up because of it, such as the River Tripper, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so people come and people kayak and they come out and see the farms, and then of course all the local restaurants serve local oysters, so it's great.
Yes, yeah, there's a great overlap between our tourism industry with our aquaculture, certainly. And in thinking about, so tell me a little bit and share with the audience sort of this season. Do you offer year-round employment? Our production is
Yes. We are one of the things we did a bunch of years ago was actually starting, I'm trying to think, maybe 2011 or 12, maybe a little earlier than that, was we tried to figure out a way that we could have oysters year round, because what happens in the upper part of the estuary is normally the water freezes over every winter. This last winter that didn't happen, and there are and it's less ice than there used to be, but even, most years, even now, there's a time when the whole river freezes over. Plus, it's very stressful to drag oysters off the bottom and handle them very much. So we tested this idea of having a site that's down near the mouth of the Gulf of the Damariscotta River, near the Gulf of Maine, where there's less ice, and we access it through Gambit Shipyard. So we lease a couple slips from them down there, and they allowed us to put a hoist on their wharf there, and so we can pull our oysters out, put them in our trucks, and bring them back to the packing plant. So that really transformed our business and allowed us to retain a workforce year round, and that's really, I think, part of what I attribute our growth to over the last decade.
Yeah.
But going back to the one other point I wanted to make about the labor force, when you look at that 100 or so people, except for a few old geezers like Smokey, myself, and I guess I would call Chris Davis and Carter Newell in the old geezer category. It's all young people who moved to Maine. It is Janet Mills, welcome home kind of a thing. A lot of people. Our business employs people with all levels of education. We have a woman who heads up our R&D who has a PhD. We have several master's people with college educations, and people with high school educations. So that's a neat part about it. It is a young workforce with a real spread of education.
Yeah, I noticed that you employ high school students.
Yep.
And how does that, one of the
couple.
interests I have in working in public education and raising a family is the message has really been like, you choose a track for your life. You're either going to college or you stay in Maine and you find work. But I think we see a shift in that, and maybe it's accentuated with the pandemic of colleges going remote and folks being closer to home longer. How has that, do you see a role in sort of that youth workforce development as part of the industry? Is that something that you're able to train employees prior to graduating from high school?
I think there could be great training programs. I've been involved in a number of efforts through Focus Maine. I'm also a co-chair of it's called C-Maine, capital SEA. It stands for Seafood Economic Accelerator for Maine, and it's I don't know if you've heard about it. It's the EDA project at the Economic Development Administration's, and it's sort of a parallel program to the For Maine, which is for the forest products, and workforce development is something that is a hot topic. Kurt Brown, who's the other industry co-chair for this, and I just presented to the Governor's Economic Recovery Council, and we, right now, I think people aren't really hiring very much yet. That we're trying to figure out what's going to happen, and it's not a lot of jobs, but I don't feel at some point we're going to get through this, right? And I think the workforce development is a really important part of the long-term economic development for Maine's coastal, marine economy.
Yeah, and I think that just what you're saying, for small businesses to be involved in pushing forward, it's important because we know that that's really where the growth lives. So I'm happy to hear that. I believe, heard an announcement that the Island Institute just received a large.
They're the project managers for that C-Maine.
Okay,
yeah.
some of the funding models and how money comes through, it was a little bit convoluted, but it sounded like maybe that's what you're mentioning.
Yes.
So several $1 million coming down for.
It's $2 million over 3 years for the, okay. and again, that's that C-Maine project.
Yeah, that's great.
And it's basically trying to, we're looking at the marine economy. What are, they're part of it. There's several subcommittees. Part of it is looking at what we have now, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, characterizing the industries more thoroughly. And then there'll probably be consultants hired to help do global and national market analyses to sort of figure out what opportunities we might be able to take advantage of.
Yeah,
It's
that's
a very exciting project, and the idea is that it includes all different types of institutions, nonprofits, government, and all that, and the congressional delegation is well represented on this steering committee,
yeah.
but that the idea is that it's driven by industry. So we'll see how it comes out, but so far it's been really an interesting project to be part of.
That's great. That's an important form of collaboration, certainly. You mentioned technology earlier and kind of your focus on that, and I'm wondering also around climate change and how, if those two things, if you see them as interrelated, but also interested in hearing, what's the forecast? We talked a little bit about the growth of the industry over the last 30 years, but where are things looking as an industry moving forward, and how does that interact with climate change and concerns about our natural environment?
So I think that climate change is probably, maybe apart from the immediate threat of the pandemic, it is the most scary and serious threat that we face. And our lifeblood is the marine environment, and the marine environment is changing really fast in really complicated ways. And I became really aware of this, on a personal level in about 2009, when we had a year, talked about this a lot, but basically we had terrible larval production problems, so that we rear all the different life stages of oysters in the hatchery, and that early, most sensitive stage, turns out that we were having a lot of problems with the pH of the seawater. And it was it was a year similar. It was a warm winter, but it was also extremely wet, and there was a lot of freshwater influx. And after we sort of got tipped off by things that were happening out in the Pacific Northwest, and a year or two before that, we figured out that we could solve the problem simply by buffering the seawater. It's like putting Tums in the water, makes it less acid. And so that was like this big warning sign flashing that we ought to start taking all this seriously, because as a graduate student, I had always been told, oh, the carbon dioxide building up in the atmosphere, the oceans are going to absorb all that, and it's not going to be a problem. Well, then before 2009, I'd heard these little inklings of people measuring lower levels of pH in the world's surface oceans, and beginning to raise some concerns. Then this whole thing happened on the West Coast, where their whole oyster industry almost collapsed. Wow. And it's not as big as the Maine lobster industry, but it's comparable. It was like $180–200 million industry. And they were unable, they had terrible larval production years. So to make a long story short, climate change is a huge concern of ours. And it's something that is part of it. We're thinking about it in terms of all of our planning for the future, and how to make ourselves as resilient as possible through diversifying and all that. Yeah. And technology will definitely play a part. And I actually have another story related to that. It seems like every 10 years we're hit with some horrible thing that makes me want to retire really fast. And this year, on top of the pandemic, we hit some kind of a big hatchery larval production problem that I believe, this is kind of hot off the press. I haven't really spoken about this too much publicly, but basically we were having no success with all those spawnings that we would do and trying to get larval cohorts through. And after, the difference was now from when, from before, was we were able to bring a lot more brain power to the problem. We have somebody who's in charge of R&D. She has a PhD in oceanography. Andy Stevenson, my hatchery manager, and I have had a lot of experience since that time. So we basically did a bazillion different tests, and And it turns out that we believe, we haven't proven this yet, that the problem is probably related to the extremely warm winter we had and the types of phytoplankton that were blooming. So, you know, to answer your question, we have to maintain, not just in Mook Sea Farm, but in the universities and public research institutions, we need to maintain the capacity to really be looking at these problems as they arise.
And it sounds
that's
like
something as a legislator, you know, we would be coming to you to support that kind of thing, because it's really crucial to Maine's living marine resources.
yes, yeah, and it sounds like it can be quite sudden, or there can be significant changes
Yep.
that can be unanticipated.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey, we're just welcoming Ryan
McPherson.
How's it
Have
going?
you two met?
No, we haven't. Ryan, Lydia Kraft, really nice to meet you.
You as well.
Thanks for joining us. Bill and
Sorry for the delay.
Yeah,
So-
no worries.
So Lydia, Ryan is one of these young people who moved from out of state, bought, you know, Glidden Point
Yes.
oyster farm, and, you know, is bringing the average age of Lincoln County down.
It's
Although
good.
I'm seeing a little more gray in that beard. I think that happens to you when you get into aquaculture.
Follow
I
the
don't know,
leader.
public education might be right there along
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
there.
Especially
Ryan, maybe do you want to just share a little bit about how you ended up in Lincoln County and what the transition has been like for you, Ryan?
Yeah, sure. So I was involved with the fisheries in Massachusetts, looking for. I got introduced to aquaculture on a USDA grant to grow mussels down in Vineyard Sound, and that kind of showed the light of aquaculture to me. And then from that point, I was looking for an opportunity in it, and it just so happened I met Barb along the way, and she was looking to move on, and was able to engage there and create a transition. And so then I came up here not knowing anything about the community, not knowing how it was going to all play out. Got into town and realized I was definitely never going to leave. It was home, and from there, I got involved with aquaculture because the team aspect of it. I think the fisheries, and I was understanding that my body can only do so much at that time, and really valued a team and what a team can do. And so that was really the first objective of mine, is to go get the people in place to help carry this thing on. So because it came from an owner operator, and so amongst all the other challenges and taking over the business, the team took first priority, and we learned how to grow oysters along the way and how we wanted to do it along the way. And but that's really been the story here thus far. I think it's been taking over the business was an opportunity that doesn't happen in aquaculture in other states. So that's one. I would have never showed up here if that wasn't in place. And then two, I think coming from Massachusetts, where it's really hard to get things done and get the communication through, I was surprised on how well we did getting it done. I think there's obviously improvements to be made along the way. There were some documents that showed up late from the DMR, and there's a bunch of other things, but it surprised me on how efficient it really could be, and where you had to get started, and how.
That's a great question. I just wonder about how each of you would describe sort of the business climate of running a business in Maine. I you know, sometimes talking about business climate becomes a little bit of a partisan issue. And I think about, you know, small businesses and our local economy is really driving the future. Kind of, Ryan, your example of, right, like recruiting, bringing people to Maine, or giving folks growing up here a reason to stay or return after, you know, some education. What is it like, or what are some of the barriers, things that could go easier to make, you know, just to incentivize that, to really say like, we're here, and this is a place that, you know, not only is a great place because of our natural resources and being able to raise a family, but also starting a business and being successful.
You want to go first, Ryan?
Sure. Well, you know, I think it's always like certainty and minimizing risk, right? So I think that for us, as we try to navigate where we want to go and how we want to get there, some of those issues are coming with changing our leases and what that looks like, and trying new gear, and expanding here or minimizing there, and doing these things. And that is really hard. It's very hard to do that. If that was easier, we could have some really positive impact tomorrow. And it would allow me to bring team in and take a little risk to put other people in places and to invest into the infrastructure and do those things. But right now we have so much pending on the table that we are stuck in the sand here, and aren't going to move capital, aren't going to recruit people just because it's clogged up. And so I think that that's one. I mean, I think that's the biggest piece right
I would
now
agree with that.
for us.
For,
Period.
sorry to clarify, I just want to make sure I understand. So obtaining leases or expanding leases, is that what's the biggest challenge?
All of those.
All of it. Yeah, I think that, I understand the process and why it's in place and what's there, but what's happening is the speed of this thing is faster than was imaginable in these development plans of it. And here we are, that all those plans are working. I'm here, there's more people into it, it's happening, but everything is behind the time. And to support this thing going forward, we got to update it very quickly.
Yeah.
in the right manner.
Yeah.
There's no need to hit the go button. I respect the people that come before me. I don't want to rush. I don't want to rush and make poor decisions. Don't get me wrong there, but before the system's is being abused and we're getting clogged, I can already tell it's getting clogged. The marine resource is getting clogged with inefficiencies in just the regulation, and that is going to prevent us to move forward. And it's preventing us right now. It's preventing me and my business right now.
Okay, that's interesting.
I think that starting with the understanding, which we all have, is that we are private businesses using a public resource. There are a bunch of frustrations around that, and DMR, I think, generally does a really good job. And I find the people working there to be really professional, and I think they actually, having been here a little longer, they've made some real improvements over the last few years, although I think that's kind of come to a grinding halt with the pandemic, right? And boy, things are clogged up, and it is, stifling economic growth. There's no question about it. Here's just one example. We have leases that are permitted for oyster grow cages, and we wanted to do a lease amendment that would allow us to use bottom cages. And one of the motivations, we actually were awarded a federal grant to do this, but we had to turn the grant down because we couldn't get approval to use those on the site. And one of the reasons for that is that if you look at things that people oppose about aquaculture lease projects, it's the visual impact of it. So the idea of being able to do some of the same things that we're doing on the surface, on the bottom, testing that out and trying it, that didn't make sway with DMR. So we got turned down on that amendment. And I disagree with the decision, I totally respect the people who made it, but it is cumbersome. And there are a couple other issues that come into play. The way the current lease statutes are written, aquaculture is the last on the list. When you go to apply for a site, if you look at the criteria, there can be no other existing use of a site that is documented. If there is, you don't get the lease. What is the term in the statute, Ryan? It's not significant use. It's there's some word that is pretty nebulous.
And so they're looking at the water usage. What else happens in that part of the river that your lease may interfere with? So
a lot of the testimony at a lease hearing is surrounding that question of, what other existing uses are there that you might unreasonably interfere with. Yeah. That's what it is.
Nice.
And
it's just a very subjective word.
Exactly. That I was having trouble pulling that up. So, that really makes it difficult. And I have seen people going to these hearings and perjure themselves. It's a really, the process is really cumbersome and really frustrated. It has to be, some of that has to be, but there are still more improvements that can be made for sure.
Mhm.
But I would just say, backing up to the original question about whether Maine is a business friendly place, I think generally it is. And the flip side of that is that if you look at what we do, our livelihoods, as I was saying before, depend on clean water.
Mhm.
And so, we are people who want pollution regulated. and to be an aquaculturist, you are de facto a water quality advocate.
Mhm. Yeah, right. I can imagine you're not looking to sacrifice our
No.
natural resources to profit at the cost of your own business. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
was
think that
interested in
there's been
looking
a
at,
lot of changes in upland, water regulations that infuriate me because, everything goes to the ocean eventually.
yeah, yes.
Sorry,
And
I interrupted
it
you.
sounds, no, that's fine. It sounds a lot like the sort of aquaculture network is really that you all work pretty closely together, that there's this investment in doing well as an industry that I'm just curious if that's unusual for your market and what it's like to be in an area where we do see a lot of expansion, and how you all work together sort of for mutual benefit.
Yeah, I think we do work better together, period. And it's improving upon as the structure of the main industry is forming. I think it has the collaboration embedded in it from the very beginning. Just we need to get the oysters from Bill to even start it. So that's one for us. But so I think it's definitely there from the beginning, just in terms of collaboration.
And what
I
has it
also
been-
think that regarding that question, that there are common threats to each of us that we recognize can be best addressed collectively. And I think one of the things that I'm concerned about right now, just sort of generally as an effort that's happening statewide, is this idea that aquaculture, that an owner-operated model was good enough for the lobster industry, it ought to be good enough for aquaculture. And there are a host of reasons why I think that's not true. One of them goes to the changing environmental conditions that require because I know what it's like to be an owner operated, starting with myself and one other person, and flipping trays until I was over 60 years old. I know you didn't think I was that old, but I am. And you wear your body out, and by forcing everybody into that owner operated thing, you really are, I think, are limiting the people who are going to get into it. And I think that has a huge impact on your ability to be innovative. And we are going to need more and more innovative minds as we face all these different environmental threats that are posed, that we're going to be seeing more and more. I mean, it's not that they're in the future, they're already here.
Yeah.
There's a company size that what I've noticed as we've gotten bigger is that you get to a certain point, you have the resources to address these problems, and that's to the entire industry's benefit. So ideally, I feel that we want to create an industry that has room for all different size companies, the full spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, this is out of my own ignorance. I'm familiar with the local industry, but what is it like as part of the statewide? I mean, how do other areas of the state compare to this region? And is there sort of a statewide advocacy arm for the industry?
First off, the Damascus River is sort of where the oyster industry formed, and it's still where, I don't know, what's the number, Ryan, 70 to 80% of Maine's oysters come out of the Damascus River. But there's been a really vibrant industry growing up in other parts of the state as well. And there's a lot of collegiality among all the farms. The Maine Aquaculture Association is a force for bringing people together. And there are some other nonprofits that are involved in that as well. The Island Institute, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And so there's a lot of working together, just together, as farms, but also through different organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I had no idea the percentage was so high for this area. I know you just look at the shell middens and you can see the deep history of oysters in this community. Just to finish up, a couple of thoughts about coming out of this pandemic and how have you, what has it been like to survive this pandemic? I'm imagining restaurants drive a huge percentage of the industry, and how are things looking moving forward? What are kind of your hopes and any strategies? What did you do to survive this? How are you still here 6 or 8 months later?
You want to start, Ryan?
We what do we do to survive it? We are young and creative here, and we didn't have as many oysters as other people. So we were able to navigate our way a little bit through it. And I think we'll come out a little bit better than we started. That's given our circumstance that we started with. So some of that foundation was this end consumer business that was kind of our black sheep of the business that we turned into our thoroughbred overnight. And then we were just have a team that I think everybody on the team is highly educated and savvy and willing to adjust, and that just paid its dues overnight for us. And so amongst all the uncertainty, we were able to keep things moving forward. I think now the next step is to, what is this? What's the outcome of this? And how can we navigate that going forward? We kept our focus pretty short, and now as we open it up, what changes and how do we grow within that infrastructure now? So.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ryan, because I think just what you touched on is really the foundation of our community, right? That commitment, that ingenuity and innovation really drive what it means to be from Maine, what it means to be from this district. And I appreciate you sharing that, because it is, we're talking about the oyster industry, but we could be talking about any industry really. And that's how I think we all survive and thrive together. So I really do appreciate that.
Yeah, I think it's the Maine brand just won. It just, when everybody was at home on their computers and dreaming about getting out of New York City, they thought about us and they thought about Maine, and we somehow was able to connect the dots there, and feel pretty fortunate to be in this neighborhood with having these photos from the back deck help out a lot, and it came through.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Bill, and what about yourself? And
so we, having been in business and through catastrophes for a long time, I had built up, some savings that have been really helpful. I will give credit to the payroll protection plan, which we availed ourselves of, and we've used that to keep people on. The challenge is that as a farm with crops and cages and husbandry to do, it's not like you can just shut down. You can't just reduce all those payroll costs. So those two things. The other thing is that a few years ago, we made the move we actually split the cost of a salesman with another company that's on Cape Cod. And he's really good. He had gotten us into some markets where, that were a little more diversified in the outlet. So they weren't quite so heavily dependent on restaurants. So that helped. So it's really a combination of things. I would say I'm pretty optimistic about the future. I think the problem is that just the level of uncertainty. A lot of restaurants aren't going to probably reopen after this, and I think there's been more markets created for direct consumer sales. Will the restaurant business come back? If not, there may be new restaurants that come in, and will they actually make the market even grow beyond what it was doing? So I think it could go either way. It's just really difficult to plan for it.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's, I mean, we could say that about our own state, right? That
Yeah.
we can balance our money right now, but looking at the 3-year $1.4 billion deficit, yeah,
Scary.
there is that kind of survival day to day, and then the long-term planning, which there are lots of cards to fall before we know really what that looks like. I actually have another campaign event I've got to get to this afternoon. But I just want to thank both of you, Bill Mook from Mook Sea Farm and Ryan McPherson from Glidden Point Oysters. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been a great conversation. And folks can learn more about both of your businesses online, social media. I think we've got a strong restaurant industry. Folks can find the goods all around. I know I first learned about the Damascotta oysters working at Suzuki Sushi Bar, putting myself through school up in Rockland, and fell in love with some Damascotta River oysters. So everyone should get out and try some if they haven't. And thank you both again for being here.
Thank you, Lydia, and best of luck to you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Take care. Good luck. Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to wrap up quickly. Thank you so much for joining us this evening talking about local aquaculture. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can send me a comment or a message here on Facebook. You can also visit my website, lydiacrafts.com, to follow along. I appreciate all of you joining us now, or for future viewing, you can see this on my website. Remember, November 3rd is our general election. I'm hosting this series, Community Coming Together, because I really believe in our community and all of its strengths. I'm running to be your next representative because I think we need a leader in Augusta who really can listen and can build these relationships and understand complex issues without necessarily being the expert every time, but knowing where to find the information. So I've just learned a lot this evening. I hope you have too. And thanks again for joining me. Take care.